Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, and thanks for listening to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined by Reverend Eric Atcheson. I should say Reverend Dr. Eric Atcheson. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I try to tell people my wife is Dr. Atcheson. I want to get those address labels that say real doctor and fake Dr. Atcheson.
Yeah, I love it. So I usually ask or talk to my guests about how I know them, or in this case, I really don't know you. I know you through Twitter, I guess, social media. So Tell me about yourself and tell our listeners about yourself a little bit.
I will say I don't underrate Twitter relationships because it's how I have the position that I'm closing out now. It's May when we're recording this.
Yeah.
I was Twitter friends for many years with a Presbyterian pastor here at Vancouver First Press, and they were staffing up to get a full-time associate pastor within the PCUSA in place, and they needed someone to kind of hold down the fort for a year and a half to 2 years while they did that search. And he basically called me up and said, "Hey, we don't really have a good interim candidates. Do you want to do this for me?" Mm-hmm. I was like, "Sure." So Twitter is actually responsible for the job I've had for the past almost 2 years, and so it's hard for me to say, well, you can't sort of get to know anybody that way. And as bizarre as it sounds, I think sometimes, as much as people will put on masks online, with fake accounts and fake personas, sometimes you can get a gander at what people are really like when sort of they don't have the consequences of having to say something to you face to face.
That's a great point.
It's a really odd place to be human.
I was listening to one podcast, pastor's podcast the other day, and a story about one pastor who, when he received critical emails from people, would make them come into his office. Hey, come in my office now, read this email to me. Yeah. And they never could. Well, tell me about, as much as you'd like, about your story, kind of what it means, what it's meant to you to be a Christian in the past, and kind of what, if there's any difference, what that means to you now.
Well, we were talking a little bit before we went live here about kind of our respective ministry paths, and you had talked about coming in initially through the UCC, and I'm a basket to casket, I call it, a disciple of Christ. Mm-hmm. I was raised in the church by my mom, and she was raised in an Armenian Congregationalist church in Detroit, Michigan.
Okay.
And she and my dad moved to Kansas for both of them for jobs, for work. And while there aren't many Armenians in Kansas, there are a lot of Congregationalist politics. Yeah. And she kind of landed in the disciples as a result and raised both my sister and me in the disciples. And, I very vividly remember being baptized, being asked by my childhood pastor, "Do you believe that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and do you accept him as your Savior?" And I think that's a perfectly good sort of question to ask as sort of the premise of baptism. It's what I ask people when I baptize them today. And I would say that has been, for the past few decades, what it tends to mean to be a Christian is a profession of faith.
Yeah.
And I would even go so far as to say that sort of all the other trappings have kind of been de-emphasized in favor of that profession of faith, which is why things like the sinner's prayer are so popular, even though it really probably shouldn't be. That this profession of faith becomes the requirement not just for Christian identity, but for employment within a lot of Christian institutions.
Yep.
or for membership at a lot of churches to have a statement of faith, not just sort of the minimalist disciple style,
Sure.
no creed but Christ, but a really extensive sort of creedal litmus test. And so I think that's what it's meant to be Christian for me in the past, and why for a long time as a child, I never thought I could be a minister or should be a minister, because I wasn't the right kind of Christian.
Wow. Okay.
I wasn't the sort of Christian that sort of saw the appeal of belief or doctrine as the be all end all.
Yeah.
And I would say today, how that's changed has been the result of sort of this renaissance that we're seeing as a result of people like Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II,
Yep.
And Liz Theo-Harris, the work they do with the Poor People's Campaign. I think we see it sort of in the shift in Roman Catholicism from Benedict to Francis.
Yep.
I think we're seeing a shift towards not away from belief, but belief plus. Belief,
okay, great.
Sort of back to that sort of core teaching in the letter of James that faith without works is dead. Well, we've seen kind of what treating, putting such a heavy emphasis on doctrine has done in terms of relational harm that it's done to LGBTQ Christians, people of color, indigenous groups, that sort of thing. And so, well, how do we keep sort of the core belief of affirming Christ, but then add to it in a different way? And I think that a lot of these figures are kind of showing us that way of what it means to be Christian now.
That's really good, and you're on topic for sure for the pod. So thanks. Tell our listeners who may not be familiar, UCC, what that means, and go into like the Congregationalists a little bit if you want.
Alphabet soup of Christian denominations.
Right.
So, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which we're a part of, is has what's called full communion with the United Church of Christ, which is another mainline Protestant denomination. And for us as clergy, what that means is we could theoretically serve a United Church of Christ church, even though we're not UCC.
Right.
And the UCC has sort of a history of sort of being on the cutting edge of social activism, especially I think for LGBTQ equality in the church.
Yeah.
And is sort of very predominant in some of the areas where disciples maybe necessarily aren't. Mm-hmm. Like disciples were kind of, in some ways, a regional denomination trying really hard to be a national denomination. But we're strongest, like we're most numerically sort of concentrated, more kind of in the Rust Belt and Appalachia.
Right.
Not many of us, in our areas in the Rocky Mountains and the West Coast.
Yep.
And so in other areas of the country, the United Church of Christ tends to have more of a presence.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Well, Eric is also an author, and Eric, you have a couple of books I wanted to talk to you about. You have a book you've written previously called Oregon Trail Theology, and then also another book coming out called On Earth as It Is in Heaven. But first, I want to ask you kind of what moved you to write Oregon Trail Theology. We're both, I'm guessing, around the same age. Yeah. Although I think I'm a little bit older than you actually, and sadly, I did not grow up playing Oregon Trail Theology. I did not have a video game system like my entire life. But tell me how that relates and how much that inspired you to write that book.
So in 2014, a writer named Anna Garvey coined this term called the Oregon Trail generation. Mm-hmm. And what she was trying to do was to come up with a term for that sort of decade of people born in the 1980s. It was sort of to differentiate between sort of older millennials and younger millennials. Not that anyone experiences better, just different.
Right.
Different experiences. And that's the term she came up with because of the ubiquity of the Oregon Trail video game, which, if you never played growing up, you can still play online. There are
I'll have to check it out then, yeah.
And I actually use that as part whenever I teach from the book as we play a little bit of Oregon Trail as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of kind of that common experiential denominator, she came up with this term, the Oregon Trail generation. And it sort of spoke so profoundly to me, being raised in Kansas City, which was the jumping off point for the Oregon Trail.
Right.
Landing here in the Pacific Northwest, which was the ending point.
Yeah.
I'm like, I actually have kind of lived this.
You've taken the path in a way.
And so how could I take the elements of the game and use them to explain sort of this topic that has caused so much, I guess, weeping and gnashing of teeth in the church, which is what has happened to our younger generations.
Yep.
And it wasn't sort of meant. I never wrote it trying to say like this is a universal thing for everyone who was kind of born in the 80s, but to take a lot of the data that was being sort of cited in these articles that were sort of asking why is the sky falling, and then placing some stories from sort of being in the trenches of seminary and professional ministry with young adults to say, here's kind of what I can tell you from both sides of that coin. So I can't just sort of rely on anecdotes. Like that's not necessarily representative.
Yeah.
You just look at the data, they're numbers on a page. They don't tell necessarily a full story. So I try to use both. And then I take elements from the game, like having to ford the river, go hunting, shopping for supplies. And each of those themes then kind of becomes a chapter in which I discuss this sort of very fraught relationship that is capable of a lot of spiritual richness, but is also, I think, filled with a lot of apprehension and trepidation, because we are the first generation to have grown up completely with the religious right and its modern incarnation in the background.
Yep.
And that, I think, has really shaped our generation's relationship with sort of public Christianity.
Yeah, what we understand is Christianity. Yep.
Yeah. And I say like sort of the Christianity that's for public consumption.
Yeah.
You know, we may not see the neighborhood church that is, you know, operating a soup kitchen on the news all that often.
Yep.
You know, but whenever Jerry Falwell Jr. runs his mouth about Muslims, it makes the 6 o'clock news.
Yep.
Right. So that's part of the conundrum is you have a generation that feels understandably repulsed by this, and as they move away from the church, that then becomes their entire experience of the church, is when it's in the news for something really negative. And so how do we kind of create a counter narrative? And that was OTT in a nutshell.
Well, yeah, that's great. Thank you. There's a quote, I think, that for me just sums it up perfectly from your book, like the frontier millennial Christians face, which metaphorically, literally, like it's all this new and brave frontier that millennial Christians are having to explore. Yeah. And I'll say, I work in a church plant context, and you have this quote from your book about young families and households that are seeing these highly valuable in church planting, because trust me, I can attest to that.
Yeah.
And that they're facing a pretty significant financial crisis on their own. So I could talk from my experience as a church planter about that, but I want to hear your perspective.
So this idea that, like, I definitely was fed this line in seminary, like, if you grow the church, the money will follow.
Yeah.
And I want to, and I'm just speaking about that one instance of my seminary education, not all of it, but in that one instance, totally wrong. Completely wrong.
Yeah.
You know, my first church out of seminary, it wasn't a church plant, but it was sort of a replanting of kind of this historic congregation that was very old, didn't really reflect its neighborhood or its context anymore. And we grew up with a lot of young families. The money did not follow.
Yeah.
Because we have sort of this Oregon Trail generation has really taken it on the chin, not
financially
once by graduating into the Great Recession from college, but now a second time when we should be starting to enter some of our highest paying years in our careers. So This idea that young families are the key to unlocking the sort of financial stability of the church.
Yeah.
Sort of was always too good to be true.
And it really puts a lot of pressure from my perspective on young families because older members and church folks in church kind of look to young families and kind of put that pressure on them and say, hey, we contributed at these levels when we're your age. Why you're not stepping up?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And, of course, the response was, well, when it was a totally different, not totally different. It was a different economic paradigm then where people still had pensions.
Yeah. So how does that, dealing with that reality, how did, for you in the past, in your past ministry context, and again, going forward, because this podcast seems to be, talking about the future, like, how do you navigate that? How did you navigate, and how do you see navigating that real challenge in the future when obviously we want to grow our churches and we want to get young families because they are the present and future of the church, but there's a very real reality of the financial challenges that come along with that.
I think of something ironically that, and I say ironically because he sort of referred to himself as the worst possible kind of atheist, but something that Anthony Bourdain said in his last book before he passed away.
Yeah.
And he was describing kind of the effect that the Great Recession had on the restaurant industry.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was massive, like total wipeouts. And he said, it sort of forced, it ended a lot of assumptions and had to sort of create new expectations of value. Like what is valued when you go out to eat? Like, is it sort of the respite from cooking? Is it because it's a special occasion? Like what creates the value? So what creates the value of a religious experience with God as meditated through Jesus Christ? And I think that answer is a little different now than it has been, and the church, it's been tough to catch up to that.
Yeah, that's a great observation.
And so what people may have wanted to pay for in the past, we look at sort of our smaller budgets and think, why should I be paying for that? Why not pay for this instead that is maybe a little more economical and we think maybe might serve the church's mission?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and that's really, in my experience, kind of where we've landed. It's not that there's no way forward. There absolutely is.
Yeah.
It's just one that is maybe a little too much of an unknown for us. And unfortunately, I do think there are some congregations that fear death less than they fear that new path.
Yeah, I 100% agree, Eric. There are definitely congregations who fear death, fear death less than the new path. Absolutely. Something you're getting at in that point, again, tying back to a quote from the book about millennials determined to make a difference in the world. Kind of, I think, goes back to what you just said about millennials still want to make a difference. It's different how they see investing their money and time and resources in making a difference, right?
Yeah. And we realize, I think, that the church is no longer the only game in town to do that.
Yeah.
Now, the church does continue to be the only game in town to do that in a way that puts Christ kind of as the motivating factor.
Right.
Like, that's what makes us unique. But if all you want to do is sort of, you really want to help people out of experiencing homelessness, well, Habitat for Humanity is everywhere.
Right.
Really interested in is expanding your intellectual horizons. You don't have to take a Wednesday evening class at church or Sunday school. You can take a class at the local community college. Or
Curiosity Stream, or all these different resources.
Wikipedia.
Love Wikipedia.
So where the church may have felt comfortable because there was something of maybe not quite like a monopoly, but a little more market share, for lack of a better term.
Yep.
We haven't adjusted well to that reality that, oh my gosh, this has been totally democratized and made accessible in ways that we could never have imagined.
Mm-hmm.
And again, like I think the church has been slow to react to some of that. And I can't tell you, I'm not the person to tell you exactly like what that cutting edge looks like.
Yeah.
Because the truth is, there are people, church planners like yourself, people who are replanting or reseeding churches, who are doing creative things that I would have never come up with if I hadn't seen them doing it first. So I'm not like the person to say, well, this is the way forward. But if you look at people in their individual contexts, and I think that's something that Mission Gathering has done a really good job of doing, because we've got a Mission Gathering a church up here in Washington, in Ithaca.
Yeah.
Is really paying attention to what works and what doesn't in that local context.
Yeah.
Because what might work really well here in Washington State may go over like a lead balloon somewhere else.
Yep.
And that's another thing that I think the main line especially really kind of is really working at trying to get better at doing.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of, you probably read it, the Cliff Christopher book, Not Your Parents' Offering Plate, about how, 50 years ago there was the only game in town as far as nonprofit giving was churches, and now there's countless nonprofits, and everybody's asking for, and there's only so many nonprofit dollars to go around.
Yeah.
So even from that perspective, it's challenging.
And it's sort of made doubly so because of the accountability that has also come with the sort of access to information and technology.
Yeah.
Maybe it shouldn't be the case, but churches do still kind of, we suffer from, guilt by association with televangelists, with churches that have had financial improprieties. And people ask, well, why should I give this money if I'm not sure it's going to be used the way I want it to?
Yep.
And maybe that shouldn't be the case for that neighborhood church that's just trying to sort of help people who have fallen through our safety nets, sort of pretty wide cracks, but it is the reality.
Yeah. Well, we're kind of touching on the surface and all around the edge of what your next book is about, at least as I understand it, On Earth as It Is in Heaven.
Yeah.
So tell me how this book relates to Oregon Trail theology, if it does or it doesn't, and then kind of what pushed you into that book.
Yeah. So there was a chapter in OTT about sort of the economic realities that the older millennials faced that offered sort of a springboard into On Earth as It Is in Heaven. And the other springboard that really created this opportunity was my Doctor of Ministry research for Seattle University, in which I studied Christian values and labor organizing here in Washington State, and specifically in the instance of the school teacher strikes that have now taken statewide twice in just the past 4 years.
Yeah.
And while that was happening for the first time in 2015, I believe, the mill workers at the largest pulp and paper mill in the area had also gone on strike. So two of the three largest employers in town, their workforces were all on strike. And I was asking myself, what's the church's role here?
Yeah.
And that, like, answering that question became the driving part of my research. And what the unionized workers who were members of churches said almost unanimously was, we don't necessarily want or need the church to just to be partisan on our behalf. But the church does need to recognize that it does still have this unique role of cultural cachet or soft power in the community, and it can use this to create venues where we can talk about what we need as workers and as Christians. What do we need spiritually? What do we need emotionally and mentally to get through something as stressful and financially punishing as a strike?
Yeah.
And that sort of became the whole impetus behind on earth as it is in heaven was, well, okay, how can we have these conversations if there's sort of nothing to base them on?
Right.
And that's why I saw it as a toolkit. Was there's Bible studies in there. There's discussion of church history. There's discussion of contemporary experience. There are study guide questions that kind of go along with those items. It's all meant to generate those sorts of conversations that union workers who practiced Christianity told me they really would want to see in a church context. And so again, it's not sort of a, here's the solution, go and apply it sort of a thing.
Yeah.
It's meant to help guide Christians in their own context towards, okay, what might be the step I can take?
Cool. Now, I'm curious, because it kind of goes back to what we kind of talked about earlier. This kind of, for many folks who grew up in our generation and younger, like you said, the only kind of real version of Christianity they've seen is the religious right. And I grew up independent Baptist, so certainly I was a part of that. And I remember in Bible college, folks would come in and talk about, voting for freedom first. And this idea where there was this melding of Republican ideology with Christian values. So for many folks, for many Christians, that's kind of like, that's anything that's not understood in that kind of context is seen as unchristian and ungodly. How do you relate to those, or how would you relate?
Oh, Lord have mercy. I was being born and raised in Kansas.
Yeah.
I talked about that and sort of not being seen as the right kind of Christian. That was part of that experience. I was not taught evolution in my public high school because that brand of Christianity controlled the state school board at the time, and they removed it from the curriculum. I didn't read Darwin until I was a junior in college, and it was for European history. It wasn't even for science. Yeah. So, I think my response would be twofold. One is just on a purely scriptural level. What is it that the centurion says at the foot of the cross when Christ dies? Surely this man is the Son of God. And for me, it's important that the centurion isn't named. The centurion can act as an audience proxy. And this sort of is where I would sort of bring our conversation full circle, where how do we move past the statement of belief? So we have the centurion statement of belief. Surely this man is the Son of God. The implication there is that Caesar isn't.
Wow. Okay.
And so the tough thing is that I think for a lot of this particular brand of Christianity that you share about, there is this pursuit of Caesar-like power rather than Christ-like power. And so I think that's one way to refocus Christianity. And I think the other way to do that is to sort of emulate the example of sort of historical Christianity. And by that, I mean, take the example I cited earlier of William J. Barber sort of bringing back the Poor People's campaign.
Which goes back to Dr. King for those unfamiliar.
Exactly. Like, it's not that William Barber thought that he was special enough to reinvent the wheel. He saw that his predecessors had already left the blueprints. Like, I don't think we, as sort of a Christianity, representing a Christianity that's meant to be thoughtful and compassionate, I don't think we need to ask people to reinvent the wheel. We just need to look back to the historical antecedents of people who sort of left us their architecture.
And I think that's a great point to bring up, because at least in my context when I grew up, there was kind of this forgetfulness of church history, even in America, and this idea that like these 20 years, like 1980, like the birth of religious right, like that is what entails Christianity. So if I'm hearing from you, it sounds like one of the best ways to reintroduce people to this broader scope of Christianity is just talk about church history in a bit.
And there are a lot of ways to do that, and that's also part of the point behind On Earth as It Is in Heaven, is to introduce people to some of this history that doesn't get told for any number of reasons. A lot of it has to do with racism. A lot of it has to do with socioeconomic class. And some of it honestly just has to do with, we have done a really bad job explaining what history can teach us.
Yeah.
And like, just as an example, like here in the Disciples of Christ, they're like, we were founded by a non-Trinitarian abolitionist. Like, Barton Stone was a heretic to by a lot of basic, by a lot of standards. And instead of like not teaching that, why are we not proud as heck about that?
Yeah.
Like, what, like, that's something that I feel like is incredibly important. Is we're the denomination that gave the world Preston Taylor and William J. Barber and Terry Hort Owens. Like, we are, we have this story that we need to get better at telling. And not just the disciples here, but just Christianity.
Yeah.
It doesn't get told because of the way we've allowed history to get written. And in some cases, the way we have really sort of, for lack of a better term, revised that history.
Yeah.
And to sort of take away those contributions of people who are of color or female or just otherwise seen as other.
Yeah. Well, for those unfamiliar, Barton Stone is understood as kind of one of the two key founders of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, or more broadly speaking, the Restoration movement, and our cousins, I guess, ecclesiological cousins, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me, I want to ask too, how do you see, or how would you frame it to our listeners, or for those kind of unfamiliar and this is a new idea, like, how would you frame what I'm going to say as economic activism, if that's a fair term?
Yeah,
how would you frame that as an act of faith? Because again, I think we so often, in so many segments of Christianity, that's seen as being political, that's seen as being, you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. So I would say it functions that way in a couple of ways.
Yeah.
One of the bits of research I did for the book was interviewing an old college classmate of mine. He and I actually debated together on the Lewis and Clark debate team, and he now organizes for the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union.
Okay.
And he said that one of the most important things that churches can do is to create a framework of values where one might not have existed before. And by that, he said, he sort of explained, like, we can take, a worker's sort of fight for fair pay or for workplace protection and safety, and say, here is why this matters for reasons way beyond one person.
Yeah.
Why it matters for the community, for the collective, in a way that is not necessarily unique, because you do have philosophies of the common good that
right.
Christianity based, but which still creates, still adds to that understanding of what the common good means. And he said that we can do that and use our own sort of cultural capital, so that the workers who are already organizing and sacrificing on strike, so that they don't have to. So another way to put it is that we are sacrificing our cultural capital on behalf of others. And I think that's tough, because white Christianity is like the pinnacle of cultural capital in the United States.
Yeah.
And we've historically been so loath to give that up.
Yeah.
And yet, when I talk to this good friend who is organizing on behalf of these workers, he says, no, that's actually what is absolutely necessary.
Wow.
Is like, that is the work that can make a difference, is to expend that capital on behalf of others and to give it up, to sort of be sacrificial, which is sort of should be a thoroughly Christian value. And yet,
one would think, yeah.
Yes. And yet, again, like I said, we really pursue this Caesar power, and have really been reluctant to give it up.
What are some other Christian values that you would say immediately tie into this?
Yeah, I would say the reversal of circumstance or reversal of fortune. So in Luke's Sermon on the Plain, in Luke 6, which is Luke's sort of best of version of the Sermon on the Mount,
right?
It's not enough for Jesus to say, blessed are ...
Yep.
He follows it up with woe to the opposite. So blessed are the poor, woe to the rich. Blessed are the sad, or the mourning, woe to those who are happy.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this reversal of circumstance that is meant to sort of change the outcomes, not just for the poor or the marginalized or the oppressed, but are meant to change outcomes for the people who have the power as well. And even people as orthodox as C.S. Lewis would say that. Lewis said in Mere Christianity that Christian sacrifice should hurt. They should pinch us. There should be things that Christians with means should not be able to do, because their sacrificial giving keeps them from doing those things.
I mean, I guess that's the challenge right now within kind of our modern cultural context of cultural Christianity, is this idea that being a Christian means kind of having it all, having the good life, right? And what you're saying is, as you understand it, following Jesus means sacrificing something, and sometimes that may mean sacrificing our own income or status so that those less fortunate or on the margins can do better. And
it's not even just a matter of having it all. It's just a matter of being at least slightly higher on the social ladder. Right? Like, I may not be wealthy, I may not have a nice house, but if I am Christian, it means that sort of my holidays are the ones that are federal holidays. I get to say, we should say Merry Christmas and not Happy Holidays. Like, it's this like I said, this cultural cachet. And so even if you don't have the white picket fence, you can still say, well, I should still be on top in other ways. Wow.
So if I'm hearing you, it's kind of this, like the reversal you're talking about is of being it's a complete, if I'm hearing you right, like a misunderstanding of what it means to follow Jesus, and that you're saying, like, we've been so into this kind of like, I get, like you said, this way of Caesar, of power and privilege, and you're saying the way of Jesus is death and sacrifice. If I'm
and the giving up of and the giving up of things. Like, to sort of go back to that holidays example, what if we gave up Christmas as a national holiday and said, okay, we're going to make Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur national holidays, or we're going to make Mubarak and Ramadan a national holiday instead of Christmas. Why should Christmas be a national holiday? Easter's not a national holiday. Why should Christmas? Like, and so if we give that up and sort of cede that territory, is that actually a loss for Christianity, or is it a growth opportunity?
Wow, that's a good future Christian question right there.
And I think that's part of the question that we have about sort of a lot of that cultural currency we have, and some of the hard currency we have, and what can we give up that creates growth? And I have to be honest, that's been a question that has sort of created a lot of the loudest backlash to On Earth as It Is in Heaven, because the entire last chapter is about the giving up on behalf of sort of this history of racial and gender oppression in the United States. And you now have seminaries starting to make reparations. What might that look like? And that has really pushed some buttons.
Wow.
When all I'm really talking about is, what can we give up that creates growth for ourselves, for others, for people we may have hurt, for people we have historically hurt? What can we give up to create growth?
Well, I love that the way you're talking that is my next question I want to get into, but I love the way you're talking about that as I'm hearing it, like a spiritual practice, right? So if I'm hearing you right, you're talking about sacrifice as a spiritual practice.
Yes. And I would include that sort of, so we've talked in this vein now for several minutes about the giving up of cultural capital on behalf of workers, of giving up material resources, whatever that is. Like, that is something that Jesus teaches has spiritual rewards, whether it's to the rich young man, or whether it's in the Sermon on the Mount. There is this spiritual reward that comes from giving up means. And I think that
now you're preaching, Eric. Now you're preaching.
I don't get to do it very often in this. So to kind of go back to the impetus behind On Earth as It Is in Heaven, how do we get ourselves to the point where we're ready to make those sacrifices? OEH kind of tries to help give you some of those spiritual tools so that it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like you're having to do this under duress. Like it's supposed to help. It's supposed to help kind of lead you to a place where it makes sense spiritually.
Well, I need to go buy the book immediately and just read the last chapter because I'm desperate to see that, because you've whetted my appetite so much. Well, let's take a quick break here, and then we'll finish up with some closing questions. Okay. All right, we're back with Eric Atcheson. And Eric, you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to, but let's say if you were Pope for a day, what's your first move?
I wonder how I got here. I got my I got my demon degree from a Roman Catholic university, but I didn't know that by itself was enough. It's a really good question that I didn't have a great answer for, and the closest I could come up with was to sort of say, well, let's do this thing that actually that the church had started to do for this review of Pius XII, who was the Pope during World War II, which was to just simply open up all of the archives, all of the Vatican.
Ooh, that would be fun.
It was definitely a double-edged sword in the case of Pius XII, because
fun for us, not for the Roman Catholic Church, right?
Yeah. Well, it's something that, coming from being ethnically Armenian and having Turkey close off its archives, its World War I archives, for the service of genocide denial, that I realized I'm really sensitive about. And I think there would be a lot to learn, both good and bad, from just opening up history. And I feel like that does tie into some of what we've been talking about earlier about how do we teach history and how do we claim it? And then hopefully, how do we begin to heal from it?
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
Tell me, are there any theological or historical Christian figures you'd want to bring back to life or meet?
So a few years ago, I did a sermon series at my previous congregation asking them, who is your Mount Rushmore of faith?
Okay.
4 people. And for me, 2 of the people I would absolutely bring back and I end up preaching on were Soren Kierkegaard, which was sort of my pet theological nerdy project.
Yeah.
And then I also preached on Nelson Mandela. Because when I was in college, I went on a trip to South Africa with Global Ministries, which is the UCC Disciples International Mission arm.
Yep.
And that was a sort of genuinely life-changing experience for me because apartheid had ended when I was very young. Like, I didn't really understand the significance of what it meant for Nelson Mandela to A, be released from prison, and B, become the president of a a post-apartheid South Africa.
Yeah.
And so I was sort of too young to appreciate what that meant in real time. And this gave me a chance, and that trip gave me a chance to begin to appreciate it. And then I got to revisit it with that sermon series.
Wow.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, you're probably familiar with the work of Phyllis Tickle to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
There's an evangelical Brady Shear, and he kind of talks similarly in a way, less philosophical, we might say, about this kind of time we're living in, being one of those kind of pivotal 500-year type moments.
Yeah.
What do you think history will remember about kind of our current time and place?
So it's funny. I said in Oregon Trail theology, I'm not sure that we're actually living through like another once every 500 years Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do feel like might be on the horizon is another Great Awakening. So we've had, depending on kind of which historian you ask, we've had 3 or 4 Great Awakenings in U.S. Christian history. Well, I mean, the first one was right before the formation of the U.S. It was when it was still the colonies. But that is sort of what I imagine happening now is an awakening that kind of does what the previous ones did and really reshuffle the religious paradigm of North America.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The disciples of Christ were born out of that second awakening, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, I think, like, just as the second Great Awakening was a response to the first, I think you could see the next Great Awakening as sort of being a response to kind of that rise of the modern religious right that we've been talking about.
Wow. Well, that sounds fast. I'm hoping, I got my fingers crossed for that one for sure.
Yeah.
Any guesses what Christianity might look like in 500 years? Big question.
No. And the best that I could come up with, and this is because my wife and I we were doing a Star Wars binge.
Oh, fun. Yeah.
May 4th. And there's this line that Mark Hamill says in The Last Jedi to Daisy Ridley. And he says, to say that if the Jedi die, the light dies is vanity. And I thought, that is such a great reassurance for sort of the American church as it sort of historically existed, is to say, like, that we can't let this fear of death keep us from continuing to change, because to say that if the church dies, the gospel dies is pretty vain of us.
Yeah, wow, that's great. I love that tie-in.
And so what does the church look like in 500 years? I don't know. But even if parts of it die, the gospel's not going to die. And to me, that actually offers like a really profound sense of peace.
I love that. Thanks, Eric, for that. That's going to stick with me. You have 2 things I love.
Thank Ryan Johnson. I know a lot of Star Wars fans don't. I thought it was a great line.
That is a great line. All right, Eric, where can people find out more about you?
Yeah. My website is Eric Atcheson, EricAtcheson.com. And I'm on Twitter at Rev Eric Atcheson. And Facebook, same thing, Rev Eric Atcheson. And you can come see the banter between me and Lauren on Twitter.
All good.
Yeah. And that's both the easiest and, for me, often most enjoyable place to find people.
Awesome. And your books are both available, I'm assuming, through your website or Amazon?
Yes. So through Amazon, through my publisher, which is Church Publishing, the Episcopal Press, churchpublishing.org, Barnes & Noble, Christian Book, kind of a lot of different outlets where you can find it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Eric, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate your time, and stay safe, stay healthy, and peace be with you.
And with you. God bless you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.